overview of the book.
Thank you so much, Dr. Makoto. We really appreciate this opportunity, and it's a big privilege for me to be able to participate in this book launch. And allow me to share a few thoughts on the background of the project, the overview, and as well as the contents. What is special about this book is that we started this book with a very key aim to say, well, this book is an attempt to address the three very important ethical themes: reconciliation, forgiveness, and violence, from an interdisciplinary and a transdisciplinary engagement. Now, Professor Marius Nel was the big initiator. He started by this process, and he sort of thought about it, and he then talked to Professor Foster and then to me. And then we decided that it would be very good if we could work on these themes from a New Testament systematic theology and a practical theology disciplinary perspective. These theological themes are simply so multifaceted and so central to the gospel of our faith that they must be reflected upon by all theological disciplines. It is worthless, in a sense, to try and reflect on these critical themes from one discipline. Our second aim, I thought, was that we should address these themes not only as lecturers, but particularly as lecturers in combination with some of our PhD students. That it's not just a project from the lecturers of a discipline or disciplines, but particularly to ensure that we get the work of our students into the public sphere. Therefore, our third aim was to say, well, let's particularly address these themes from an African perspective. And therefore, it was key to this project to hear the voices and read the work of some of our doctoral candidates and doctoral alumni from across the African continent. And for that, we thought it is important that we should really make sure we get this message across from our continent. We are very thankful that this book forms part of the Beyers Naudé Centre for Public Theology series. And of course, I'm very excited that this is the first publication from our unit, the Unit for Reconciliation and Justice, that is housed within the Beyers Naudé Centre for Public Theology under the chairmanship of Professor Foster. Chair, allow me to share a few thoughts on the overview of the process. The contributors firstly engage with one or more of these identified ethical themes from their specific disciplinary perspectives in their respective contributions. And we wanted them to make sure that they do that. We then asked them to reflect on aspects of reconciliation, forgiveness, and violence from their respective African contexts, which is very important as well, that it's not a top-down approach, but really something that develops from a bottom-up, from the context where people live themselves. We then also wanted them to employ the tools and the resources of their respective disciplines. And at the end result, you will agree with me that it's a much richer and textured set of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary theological insights that I think will really help all of us to engage and to navigate these issues with a greater measure of understanding and a broader perspective than just a single approach might ever offer. So we are very grateful of this bigger interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary focus. We then organized a symposium held in Stellenbosch on the 13th of April 2017, where the contributors had the opportunity to present their work as well as engage with each other's work. And I thought that was a very, very important moment in the whole process, because that engaged quite good debate and allowed our contributors to work and to engage more in depth with their ideas and their understanding. Now, the aim of the engagement further was that somehow these three disciplines really should help us to enrich the understanding of the critical notions of human dignity in relation to this conversation. You know, the relationship between the discourses of human dignity, violence, reconciliation, and forgiveness offers a wealth of material and interdisciplinary academic research. And therefore, it's important that we should place a lot of emphasis on that. Now, the book is grounded on an understanding that human dignity is, of course, a complex concept that requires careful and rigorous consideration in order to explicate the implications of sound theological practice and sound practice as well. This publication, therefore, brings together what we want to believe a variety of disciplinary and intersectorial, intersectional identities that helps us to enrich the discussion and to enrich further discussions as we continue to journey with these very key themes. Of course, then we decided that, you know, after the students and ourselves have sat down and drafted our contributions, we started with the editing process, and we were so thankful that the last editing was done by Professor Hansen, who is the serious editor of this Beyers Naudé Centre for Public Theology. And after he completed his very key work, it was then sent to the publishers. So that's a little bit on the process. Chair, then a few comments on the contents of the book, which I think is the most key part of this short contribution from myself. Now, we decided to structure the book, of course, as everybody would agree, that the biblical disciplines are the first discipline, they're sort of the key discipline that starts the conversation. And then it is the space for systematic theology. And then the practical theologians will conclude with the last few chapters. So the first three chapters, with the focus on reconciliation, forgiveness, and violence within the New Testament, started with the first chapter by Professor Marius Nel, with the key title, Matthew's Reconfiguring of Salvation in a Context of Oppression. He focuses on Matthew 1, verse 21, in order to understand how the author of the first gospel appropriated the first century Jewish messianic hope for salvation for his particular community living within the context of the violence of the Roman Empire. Now, this was followed by one of his students, Dr. Ndale McKinnon from Ethiopia, who wrote a quite important chapter on conquering evil, engaging violence from the perspective of Paul's letter to the Romans. He argues that in the context of Roman Empire, where violence was ambiguous, Paul represents such violence as being part of the concept of evil. Then this is followed by a Nigerian student of Professor Nel, Godwin Etukumana, who wrote a chapter with the title, The Reconciliation of Lepers, in Luke 5, verse 12 to 15, and its implications for human dignity and African perspective. The specific focus of this chapter is on the various ways in which the gospel, according to Luke, describes the reconciliation of those who had become estranged from their communities, with special reference to the case of the lepers. This section then is followed by the next three chapters from the discipline of systematic theology, starting with Professor Dion Foster, who wrote a chapter with the title Towards an Impossible, and the im of the word impossible between brackets, politics of forgiveness, question mark, considering the complexities of religion, race, and politics in South Africa. He engages with the complexity of a politics of forgiveness in South Africa 25 years after the end of political apartheid. He draws upon a 4-year qualitative empirical study of how Black and white South African Christians understand the processes and notions of forgiveness in the light of South Africa's complex economic, social, and political context. This is followed with a chapter by Dr. Elise Brown with the title Jesus Within the Genres of the Human, Sylvia Winter, African Philosophy and Post-Colonial Conceptions of the Non-Violent Resistance of Jesus. She uses a post-colonial hermeneutic to demonstrate the ways in which a reconceptualization of the human renders possible a theology that uncouples humanity from political subjectivity. This chapter is then followed by a chapter from Jaco Botha, one of another student from Professor Foster, with the title Lessons from Mr. Noki, Empire, Structural Violence, and the Missio Dei. He uses the social location of Mr. Noki, who was killed in the conflict between Lonmin's Marikana mine management and their workforce as a lens to critique the church's engagement in issues of violence, which undermine the dignity of the most vulnerable peoples in the new South Africa. The last three chapters that focused on this very key themes was from the discipline of practical theology, and I started to write the chapter with the theme or the title Transferring Frozen Conflict to Future Generations in Search of a Contextual Pastoral Approach. In this particular chapter, I tried to reflect on the reasons why the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not implemented, and why, in a sense, the government and civil society and the religious groupings have, in a sense, neglected their responsibility to ensure that this does take place. And that has caused that we, what I want to call, are in a state of frozen conflict. And I try to reflect from the perspectives of contextual pastoral approach, how we could deal with those, with this complex reality we are in. Then the next chapter was written by Benaya Nyakuri, a Burundian student who currently lives in Namibia, who wrote a chapter with the theme Reconciliation in Burundi Crisis, a practical theological approach. He examines the ethnic conflicts that have been a cause of the political unrest in Burundi in order to emphasize the role of practical theology in peace building and the church in reconciliation in Burundi. The last contribution from practical theology is written by Dr. Two Dukes from Nigeria. And it's wonderful that he's present and that he will say a few words just now. And he wrote this chapter with the title, The Praxis of Reconciliation Among Religious Groups in Northern Nigeria, a Pastoral Care Approach. He examines the praxis of reconciliation among the religious groups, Christians and Muslims in Northern Nigeria, with the intention of finding the factors that affect the success of reconciliation. We then asked Dr. Willem Verwoerd to write a concluding chapter for this contribution. And Dr. Verwoerd titled this concluding chapter as follows: Transforming Christian between brackets, apartheid. He invites the reader to commit to the complex and odious task of reconciliation that is coupled with justice. He does so by sharing aspects of his own journey towards reconciliation and experience that he has gained from sharing in the journeys of others who are on this path. And we really valued the contribution from Dr. Verwoerd. Chair, I have 1 more minute left. I want to make 2 final comments, if you don't mind. I just want to remind everybody that this volume is dedicated in the memory of Professor Herman Russell Botman. He was not only part of our faculty for many years, but he was also the rector of our university. it was Professor Botman's commitment to human dignity that was the basis of this project. This process out of which this volume comes was supported by the Hope funding that he secured for the Stellenbosch University. And we want to thank him, and we were grateful that we could dedicate this to him. I want to thank his wife, Beryl, that gave us that permission. Thank you so much. And then lastly, as mentioned by our chair in the beginning, after the completion of this manuscript, we received the very, very sad news that Dr. Elise Brown passed away because of a sudden illness. She was a very promising and brilliant theologian, and we're deeply saddened by her untimely death. And therefore, we really hope that the work that she was so committed to will serve as an inspiration and invitation to others to deeply think and act courageously for justice. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Professor Christo Tesna, for giving us an overview of the book, the process and the content of the book, and also that you dedicate this book as these editors and scholars who wrote this beautiful book to Professor Russell Botman, who's birthdaying on Sunday, this coming Sunday, and we also have the lecture, the memorial lecture on Monday evening. I do hope that people will look at the Faculty of Theology website and also Facebook to see when is this event taking place on Monday. Thank you so much for this background. This is a really valuable book, and I will encourage people to really give a take and also read it for not only for interest, but also for reconciliation in Africa. It's a very important book. But our next speaker now, I will introduce to you Reverend Od Two Dukes. He's a lecturer with the Gombe State University in Nigeria. He recently obtained his PhD with Professor Christo Tesna in Practical Theology at Stellenbosch University, with a sub-discipline in pastoral care and counseling. Dr. Two Dukes is passionately concerned with the interreligious challenges in Nigeria, where he is making some contributions in the context of Nigeria as a scholar. He's one of the authors of the book, as you heard and listened to Professor Christo Tesna, who mentioned that he contributed a chapter in this book. But I welcome you, Dr. Two Dukes, in our midst. You can unmute your microphone, and I want to hear from you, from the author's perspective. Based on your chapter, why is religion and violence such a complex issue in your context in Nigeria?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. It's my pleasure to partake in this wonderful program. The first factor responsible for the inter-religious challenges, which of course brings about the complexity of religion and violence, is what I describe as inter-religious dysfunctional relationship that's had its background from the colonial times. And at that time, there was this issue with the colonial masters where they nurtured the two religious groups distinctly without, giving them the same way of handling them as different communities. So it was rather identified with different preferential treatment, where the other one was given preference over the other one. And that became the background of the dysfunctional relationship between Christians and the Muslims in northern Nigeria. Now, this particular issue began to spur conflict between the two religious groups through acts of provocation, blasphemy, and scapegoatism. Now, this issue began to work at the background when there was no effort made by the colonial leaders, towards addressing this issue. And as time went on, the relationship began to manifest in religious attack. In some cases, violent confrontation between the two religious groups, those making the victim and the perpetrators alternating their status, just like saying yesterday's victim becomes today's perpetrator, and vice versa, because there was no address to the particular challenges, affecting these two religious groups. So that actually became the background to the problem that we have today, where religion and violence becomes very, very complex. The second issue that I would also consider as another factor is what I will borrow from the chapter of Professor Tessner, Frozen Conflict. Now, despite this issue, from all the research I have done in my chapter, there was no any effort made by the religious leaders or the political leaders towards healing and reconciliation of the challenges between these two religious groups. What was actually focused on, which of course it was good as a first priority, trying to quell down the conflict. Now, when the conflict was quelled and controlled, the leaders became comfortable that that has sufficed, not knowing that they've actually succeeded in keeping the two religious groups under frozen conflict. And this frozen conflict becomes a time bomb. And that is why crises in Nigeria kept coming on, because the issue between the two religious groups has not been addressed because of this particular issue. Now, the last point I want to say about this point is that that motivated this issue of the complexity is the intercourse of religion with ethnicity and politics. These three, you cannot separate these three. When issue arise with ethnic, or crisis arising with ethnic or with political issue, it quickly metamorphoses into religious crisis, because these three things are always working together. So this makes conflict between the religions becoming very, very complex. And looking at the issue of these two religion and violence becomes very prominent among the religious groups, because the issue has never been addressed. It's just an idea that people will think about it, and they will discover that what is going on there is what they refer to as dialogue, in which when they talk about dialogue, they focus on the future, what needs to be done in the future. But in talking about the past, that has been kept silent about that. So these make the religious issue or religious crisis reoccurring, because the issue has not been addressed from healing and reconciliation perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doc. Very, very good answers there. Really, we are struggling to really to deal with reconciliation issues, especially amongst religious of the world. Then my second question will be much more, and I will couple these two questions together so that you give us an overview of your answer on this. You propose an approach to reconciliation in the northern Nigeria that is based on theological praxis. Can you please give us some ideas on how Christians and Christian communities in your context can work towards reconciliation? And my last questions that maybe you can also sum up is that, what do you hope theologians, pastors, and Christians might learn from your chapter and other chapters in this book?
Okay, thank you so much. First and foremost, it is important for Christians, theologians, and pastors to understand that reconciliation is a biblical and theological concept. So we have to be interested in the term reconciliation, so that whenever there is an issue, there are various ways of motivating reconciliation. Now, in the context of this question, I will advise that pastors, theologians, and Christians altogether should be able to think of how they can understand this concept of reconciliation and work towards it. It requires sacrifice. So Christians need to understand that it requires sacrifice, because in working toward reconciliation, I would advise that there is need for these believers, these Christians, and religious leaders from the Christian perspective to create a space in our religious cycle a space that will allow the other religious group to come in. Now, when I talk about space in the context of hospitality, the space would have to be both in the heart and in the house, and even in the religious sectors. Maybe let's talk about religious congregations. Open up that space where other religious groups can come in. Then that will motivate process of reconciliation. Now, there is also need for interreligious lifestyle that need to be practiced, particularly in public spaces where social amenities are shared. I believe when Christians live a religious life interreligiously, it will motivate reconciliation. And also, I would like Christians to also develop interest in learning and listening to religious understanding of the other faith, talking about opening up to Muslims, to Islamic faith, to understand what is happening because of the nature of the religious groups in northern Nigeria. We are living together. So it's important that we open up to understand what is happening in the other faith, and that will really help. And in relation to your last question, indeed, my chapter has made a contribution that I believe that there are lessons in there that can be helpful for leaders, pastors, theologians, and even Christians themselves. Now, in the first place, I believe that this chapter revealed the fact that Christians and Muslims are living in deep-rooted trauma. Now, realizing this point that Christians and Muslims are living in deep-rooted trauma, then there is need for the two religious groups, particularly, like I said earlier, Christians need to initiate a way towards reconciliation to address this traumatic state of the two religious groups. And secondly, there is also a lesson that I believe my chapter deals with pastoral hermeneutic process that gives attention both to victims and perpetrators, where storytelling is crucial in healing and reconciliation process. So whatever Christians may think of themselves of, either they are thinking that they are victims or they're thinking that they are perpetrators, hermeneutical process will carry both the two in addressing the two together. So this is crucial lesson that they can learn. They can learn from. And finally, the chapter also contains some ways of practical interreligious care. Discussions such as hospitality, multi-religious prayers, and practice of golden rule will be of help as two religious groups live together. They understand that we have a source, we have something that we have in common that will be of help in the two religious groups. Lastly, other chapters that we have, just as it has been said, they are written from different perspectives, all aiming toward reconciliation. So I believe that this perspective will help even in the context of Nigerian challenges. Other chapters are very, very crucial and helpful in resolving and addressing the challenges that we have in northern Nigeria. Thank you, Sipo.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Two Dukes. Very important discussion indeed. And I'm really interested in reading all these chapters. I've read one chapter from this book already, and that is from my head of department. I will read more of these chapters. It's also give us an idea that really we are indeed in a space where we as religions of the world, we need to have peace with each other, because that will bring stability in the world. If the religion is caught up in causing conflict, it really brings the world into chaos. Thank you so much for your contribution. Now, without further ado, we have in our midst the only lady at this panel. It's really very important very good to have you, Ms. Ayanda Nyoka. Ms. Ayanda Nyoka, she's a dialogue facilitator and is committed to promoting peace and reconciliation in South Africa. She is particularly interested in facilitating and creating spaces for healing in Black communities, especially for Black women. Currently, she is taken up a residential master's fellowship at the Historical Trauma and Transformation Research Unit at our university, Stellenbosch, and is working towards completing her MPhil program in Religion and Culture. Ms. Ayanda Nyoka, her thesis explores the role of Pentecostal spirituality in Black women's experiences of trauma and healing. Welcome, Mrs. Ayanda Nyoka. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I want you to really give us a reflection on the project from a current researcher in the field. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sipho. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. Sure, and thank you very much for the introduction as well. And also, I just want to also express my appreciation for the invitation to offer some reflections on this important work. And I also want to congratulate the editors and the authors who are involved in this project for what I think is a critical theological framing and grappling with these complex issues in ways that open up possibilities for us not only to make sense of, but also to unravel the multi-level structures that have inflicted historical and continuous collective violence to groups of people in the world, particularly in Africa. So having worked on reconciliation and justice in Africa, in South Africa, primarily through a social political lens and witnessing the ways in which oppositional frames of anger, hurt, dismissal, mistrust, and so forth undermine efforts towards reconciliation, it became apparent to me then that these are not merely political concepts that we are working with. So in that way, I do want to echo the editors of this book, that indeed these are theological concepts that calls for an interdisciplinary perspective in how we move forward. And so I resonate strongly with Helen Vervoort's insistence on a spiritual embodiment of reconciliation and justice. Further on, I think to assert a role for the church in reconciliation at this time, particularly in this time of South Africa's transition, I think in itself is a radical discourse, given the ways in which the church is implicated in histories of violence, particularly in Africa. So I was quite pleased to note that this history of the church is adequately acknowledged and confronted in this publication, so that the church itself does not fall into a savior complex, but is called upon to be reflexive in how to move forward on the issues that have been raised in this project. At this point, I'm going to kind of focus on the reflections of having looked through this book. In my reflection, I want to focus on possibilities, which I think this book opens up in terms of how we might advance reconciliation and justice. And also I want to further reflect on how we might broaden our discourse on healing the wounds of our past. So for me, one of the incredible ways in which this book opens up possibility amidst what seems to be a context of disillusionment with reconciliation, particularly in South Africa, is the way that it centers the potential to reconstruct victim-perpetrator relations and points to theological frames for how we might do that in ways that can foster some of the concepts that have been discussed in this group, such as relational proximity, relational solidarity, issues of trust, issues around belonging, forgiveness, and so forth. So importantly, I think this potential in the dialogical encounter between the so-called victim groups and perpetrators group is not a simple reassertion that we need dialogue per se, where we get to meet each other as though these encounters are not fraught with real difficulties. I think those of us who have been engaged in intergroup dialogue processes are all too familiar with ways in which walls come up in this victim-perpetrator frame that we work with, and the constraints that this present for a transformative encounter of the other, even when the rules of courtesy, listening, and so forth are laid out. And so for me, what I find particularly useful about these theological framings that are presented in this project is that they cut deeper to surface underlying psychological and political dynamics that lie beneath the surface of which shape victim-perpetrator dialogical encounters in ways that impede the prospects for reconciliation, forgiveness, and justice, importantly, for rehumanizing each other. So in that way, I think this project helps us to grapple with the intricate work involved in reconciling former enemies and creating a just society. And I think without that understanding, dialogue platforms can themselves be undermined. Therefore, one appreciates the careful consideration of under what circumstances, under what conditions can intergroup dialogue be transformative? And also perhaps to consider under what conditions intragroup dialogue becomes necessary or becomes an appropriate action prior to intergroup encounters. I think also importantly, one appreciates that the possibility that the authors have mapped up in terms of this dialogical encounter, intergroup encounter, is predicated upon just relations in the ways that this project articulates an intersectional understanding of the interpersonal, intergroup work and structural transformation. I think by doing so, it affirms the need for a radical notion of reconciliation that is not predicated on problematic notions of forgiveness or guilt purging encounters, but that actually puts us in right relations with the other. And I think the right relations for me underscores being the process of working towards repairing the consequences of historical and ongoing collective violence, particularly in the context of South Africa. And then lastly, in my reflections, I'm interested on the question of how do we heal the wounds of the past, particularly from the perspective of victims or so-called survivors. I think in ways that go beyond repairing the socio-economic consequences of that past and the ongoing violence, but in ways that force us to reckon with the psychic wounding of that past, particularly on victim groups, and how we might understand the intersections between the psychic wound and contemporary challenges, particularly around community violence in South Africa. So there seems to, for me, when I look at what's the developments in the fields of reconciliation, there seems to be a growing recognition that because of the emphasis on moving on from conflict, the psychosocial impact of that violence, particularly on the lives of victims, has not been sufficiently given attention. So it seems to me that the work on reconciliation and justice should consider victim-centered approaches of empowerment that are multidimensional, that push for investment in the psychosocial well-being of victim groups, particularly if we give sufficient attention to how apartheid as a system began to destroy the nurturing that comes from family life, that began to destroy cultural identity and selfhood. So unfortunately, I think this is a wound, the psychic wound is a kind of a wound that we can't easily touch in the way that we can easily point to material inequalities and so on. So I do suspect that in our public discourse, we haven't yet found a language to articulate what lies below the visible wound of economic injustice. So I'm often myself drawn back to Biko's philosophy of Black consciousness, perhaps as an avenue that we could utilize to think about how do we repair traumatized identities in ways that help those of us who come from victim groups to transform these victim-perpetrator frames that we're working with. But also seem to be stuck in, to begin to integrate frames of community agency, frames around community pride, community responsibility, and aspiration. And so in conclusion, I do think that this is an important contribution to the field, not just in theology, but also for those of us who continue to work within the social political lens of these issues, which I think do intersect across disciplines. So thank you very much and well done.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ayanda. Thank you. And you close up with a very important question that we always struggle to answer. How do we heal the wounds of the past? It's a very, very difficult question indeed to answer. Now, colleagues, thank you so much for all of you. Now it's a time for question and answer. All our colleagues who are joining us on Facebook, who are joining us on Zoom, as well as the panelists who are here will answer your questions. You pose your question on the question and answer section, and then we will really answer your questions. I'll give the panelists to give some answers on the questions. Vikas Van Zyl is working in the background looking at these questions. But the question that I have here in front of me, it's not a question actually. We have an important person in our midst, Professor Reginald, who congratulates the editors and the authors for this publication. And Professor Reginald says really congratulations to the authors and also the editors of the book. And we have the details that are given here by Sun Media, where you can find the book, Take a Lot and Google Books. Vikas will speak to that as soon as possible. Then we also have a question from YouTube. Connie Randall asked, can Dr. Two Dukes please elaborate can Two Dukes elaborate on the interplay and dynamics between ethnicity, politics, and religion? Can you elaborate on the interplay and dynamics between ethnicity, politics, and religion? That's a question that comes to you, Dr. Two Dukes. And we request people to really pose their questions. And Professor Judy Claessens is also in our midst. She's congratulating all the contributors for this important publication. Thank you so much, Prof. We also have some questions. Two Dukes, you must take that question. We have questions in our question and answer section. In the case where reconciliation is needed between two different religions, like in Nigeria, how could a Christian theological understanding of reconciliation be understood by people of other faiths? What happens when the two religious groups understand reconciliation differently? Thank you. It's coming from Anonymous, who also asked a very important question. Then Dorothea Hendricks says, every generation can find causal connections between our tough realities and a political dispensation, e.g. violence, poverty, to colonialism. Would you feel, Dr. Two Dukes, that there may be a value in putting hand in own bosom, like discerning what we all can examine inside our own context, in cultures, religious experiences, that in itself may be causal too? We are able to change ourselves or our own foresee far easier, possibly, than reverting causal in history only. What in this kind of perspective may hold some way forward in reconciliation, forgiveness, and negating violence? So there are two questions, Dr. Two Dukes, that are coming to you. You may take both of them. I will remind you if you forgot the first question. The first question is coming to you to elaborate on the interplay and dynamics between ethnicity, politics, and religion.
All right, thank you so much. Just like I said earlier, that religion has found itself in intercourse, within these two important group, ethnic and politics. And the three, actually, it becomes very, very difficult in Nigeria for you to separate. And when people are into political affairs, religion is there. Ethnicity also, you cannot separate them from religion. So even in politics, people always have religious affiliations. And in fact, the last presidential election in Nigeria was actually based on religion. So the interplay between these three actually is very, very common, and it is very, very difficult in our context, very, very difficult to separate these three. This is how Nigerians have just found themselves within these three realms of important issues. And what I believe will be helpful in terms of addressing some issues of interreligious challenges, dialogue. Dialogue is crucial. If Christians want to understand something about Muslims, or even to understand how Muslims understand reconciliation, because reconciliation is both practiced from Islamic and Christian perspective. So for Christians to understand Islamic perspective, or for Muslims to understand Christian perspective, dialogue is crucial. Dialogue is crucial. I look at dialogue as something that will help and motivate reconciliation, talking together, and that will enable the other religious group to listen to what the other group is saying about reconciliation. For example, it's not just taking up, like, for example, the word peace. I know peace is a word that is seen or understood relatively. So it's important for the two religious groups to understand what each group is saying about peace, were about reconciliation. So that will really help. And the second thing that will help also is interreligious understanding. You know, it becomes so very difficult for one religious groups to learn or to even listen to what the other religious group is saying. And I have proposed that even in academics, that there is need for learning interreligious courses, so that even as younger students coming up, they should be able to understand what is happening in the other religious group. The last question, maybe you need to just highlight that on me. Let me just hear that again. The last question, the third question, please.
The last question, if I may read it to you, it's much more what in this kind of perspective may hold some way forward in the reconciliation, forgiveness, and negating violence. So she says, we are able to change ourselves, our foresee far easier possibly than reverting causal in history only. So what kind of perspective may hold some way forward in reconciliation, forgiveness, and negating violence?
Yeah, like I pointed in my earlier discussion, the problem that we have is focusing on the future. We forgot to talk about the past. So for reconciliation to be effective, there is need for visiting the past. And that has to do with storytelling. It's important that we understand what has happened. It's important that Christians talk so that Muslims will listen to what they are saying, and Muslims will also talk while Christians should also listen to them. Now, discussing the past will really help towards understanding how the issue of forgiveness, the issue of confession, the issue of remorse will come into play. But just like that, the issue will not just be spoken like that by talking about dialogue, talking about what will happen in the future. It's better we start by looking at the future to see how looking at the past and see how the future can now be focused on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Two Dukes. And we only have one question. I will also take it and then maybe quickly respond to that. It's a question that is open. Anyone on the panel can say something about it. It's coming from Alexander Fisher. I think it's one of our students. With such an important issue as reconciliation, is there at present an ongoing platform that intersect with religious, political, and community sectors? That's a question anyone can answer to that. It's not specified to Dr. Two Dukes. With such an important issue as reconciliation, is there at present an ongoing platform that intersects with religious, political, and community sectors? Who wants to go for it?
Sipho, let me jump in here because my chapter focused specifically on the notions of a politics of forgiveness. And thanks to everyone who's joined us today. It's been wonderful to see messages and congratulations. And just before I answer the question, just to say how much I appreciate each of the authors and the editors. It was such a joy to work with you. And Ayanda and Two Dukes, your inputs today just make it so wonderful and worthwhile. And of course, Sipho, my colleague, such a gift that you're leading us through this.
Thank you.
Alexander, I think one of the things that we're needing to recognize is that concepts such as forgiveness are deeply political. So we don't need to look for places where we find these intersections between faith and political life. If we were to take forgiveness truly seriously, if we were to ask ourselves, not only what does forgiveness sound like, what does the concept of forgiveness look like? If we were to say, what does it feel like to live in a society in which forgiveness is a reality, a possibility? Then we would find that it is something that's very deeply political. We would want to transform economic structures. We'd want to deal with questions related to the issues of land. We'd want to see our political systems transformed so that power inequalities are lessened. So I think that, particularly as Christians, when we read our sources, so that's the Christian scriptures, which Professor Nell and his colleagues worked on, when we think about the history of our faith, we can see that these notions are very much about the political transformation of our lives together with others. There was one particular quote that struck me in this book that I've held onto, and it comes from Paul Ricoeur, who says that forgiveness gives memory a future. Isn't that a beautiful thing to think about? If we can find ways to transform the present politically, economically, and socially, we give our memory a future. We can give it a better future. We can redeem the future by dealing with our past. So I tend to think that these things are taking place everywhere, whether it's in our homes, our schools, our businesses, even in our churches. Forgiveness is a deeply political concept.
Thank you so much, Professor Dion Foster, who is also a contributor in this book. Now I will really ask our brother, Mr. Wikus van Zyl, who is working as a publisher of this beautiful book at African Sun Media, to give us the details with regard to the price of the book and where can we get this book, Wikus?
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists, thank you to the editors, and thank you also to the attendees for joining the launch. It's such a special occasion to launch this wonderful book. The book is available on all of our platforms in print and electronic format. So it's on Google Books, it's on Takealot, it's on Amazon, it's on ITSI, EBSCOhost, and ProQuest. So available internationally and print and electronic format. I posted the links in the chat, so please follow those. And also for those joining on Facebook and YouTube, I also posted the links there. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Wikus, for that information. You can get all the information on your Facebook and also YouTube, and also those who joined us on Zoom, you can download the link. I see we have about 40 participants. The number, when I check, it was 49. It was decreasing and decreasing. People are going to the gym. Now I will welcome our own colleague, Professor Nell, who's an associate professor of the New Testament in all the New Testament department at Stellenbosch University. Welcome, colleague, and please, I'll give you this platform to thank everyone who's joining us on this platform, on all social media platforms tonight.
Sipe, can I just check from your side, can you hear me and see me? Or
clear, we can see you and hear you.
Okay, that's a slightly scary thought, but from my side, thank you for everybody that's tuning in. It's always wonderful to engage with people, and what this project has actually taught me is the more people you can engage with, it's just so much the better. So Sipe, I want to start off by thanking you. You're looking very snazzy, and you've done excellent taking us through the whole program within time and in your usual professional manner. We truly appreciate that. And then for Dr. Two Dukes and Ms. Nyoka, it was wonderful listening to you. And every time we hear new people engaging with the same sort of concepts, we just realize how many people there are that are deeply reflecting on these themes that need to be included in further books, present and further books. So we'll be taking notes of everybody that has responded to this conversation. So I just want to say a few thanks. Because we basically thank everybody, but the project actually started in 2017. This is fast for academics. We started talking in 2017, and the first funding that we applied for was actually, if I can remember correctly, Christian and Dion must help me, was actually administered by Professor Judy Claessen's the Human Dignity Project, under was like a subsection of the Hope Project. So that's where we actually got our funding. So thank you to Professor Claessen's for her role in getting us the initial funding. And then since we took a bit longer to finish than we thought, we needed some extra funding, and Subcommittee A, for those outside Stellenbosch University, that's one of our research committees, actually gave us some extra funding. So that's Professor Klutter's tribe. I mean, we thank them for their funding. But then, colleagues, it's thank you to my co-editors. It was a pleasure working with you, and for all the authors. This was actually a painless process in getting the chapters in, getting the revisions done, getting it published. I've heard horror stories about editing books. This book actually gave me false hope of how it works. Thank you for all this to Sun Press, Vickers, to you and your colleagues for the absolutely professional way that you've dealt with us, the collegial way, the helpful way. It is wonderful having you as a strategic partner in this regard. So thank you from my side to all of you for attending, participating, reading, and hopefully buying the book. Thank you.
Thank you, colleague. We have few people that are really thanking you for your work. Stephen Martin, who's from Canada, is really saying thanks to all of you for your work. The book looks great, and I'll almost certainly read it. I apologize that I have to ditch now. Blessings from Canada. Then we have Dorothea Hendricks, who says thank you once again for this book. I have to slip out now, but she really says thank you so much for listening to you, and that she could participate or listen to all of you colleagues. Yes, thank you so much to all our viewers at this beautiful launch. Please don't forget to go and buy the book. You have all the connections. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I want to thank my panelists who are sitting here. Thank you so much for your contribution. It's been wonderful to have you, and please have a good evening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you so much.